In today's video, I'm giving you some of my watercolor tips. So tip number 1, tape your paper down. You can use painter tapes, you can use some other type of tapes. What I mean is you want to get your paper and tape the edges down so that we don't have this wavy effect that happens to the watercolor paper once it gets a lot of water on it. I just go around, tape the edges down, and also it helps if you are going to frame your pieces with a matting to get the correct measurements, and it makes it easier to frame overall. On to tip number 2. Tip number 2, the 4 painting styles of watercolor. This is something that sometimes art teachers cover, but I want to cover in a video just in case you don't know about it. It's going to be wet on wet painting style, meaning the paper is wet, so it's a brush. The wet on dry, meaning wet brush, dry paper. Dry on wet, and dry on dry. So on here on the left word of each set of the 4 is going to be the type of brush strokes we're going to be using. The second word is going to be the paper. So on the left we're going to be using wet brushes. On the right they're going to be dry brushes. On the top the paper is going to be wet. On the bottom we're going to have dry paper. I'm going to go ahead and wet the paper where it needs to be wet, which is going to be the top 2 squares that we're going to be using. And then what I mean by wet brush is the brush is going to be loaded up with a lot of water and the color. With wet on wet, it's very good for a nicer evenly spread area. Now we're going to do dry on wet, meaning I'm using a lot of less water on the paintbrush, so it gives you more of a texture. Wet on dry, a little bit different, and dry on dry you're gonna have a very scarce application of the color, and it's going to give you a lot of texture. I'm going to add a different color so you can see how it blends together as well. The wet on wet is very good for skies or water or any large areas you're trying to create a gradient. Dry on wet is going to give you something similar but with a lot more texture. Wet on dry is just going to give you a very nice coloration, and dry on dry is just a lot of texture throughout. Now to step number 3, finding the right brushes. Now, one of the issues that a lot of people have with watercolor painting is the paper. It doesn't always have to be about the quality of the paper, it also has to do with the quality of the brushes. A lot of the times the paper begins to fall apart because the brushes that you might be using could be too rough. Here I'm giving a little example. This is a brush I've been using. It goes on quite smoothly on the paper. This other brush is a little bit rougher, and if you use it a lot on a lot of the wet areas, it's going to start breaking up and disintegrating the paper. This is how you can find out if it got a good brush or not. Rub it against the back of your palm. If it's soft and nice, good brush. If it's rough, it's not. Tip number 4, different types of watercolor, meaning what type of paints are considered watercolor and in what type of forms do they come in. So I'm going to show you 3 different types of watercolors that I've used. I like them all. I do recommend that you find one that you like or you try out first and kind of stick to it, because it does give you a very similar result. So the first one we have is the palette. It's going to be the dry little squares or circles of paint that get activated by adding water. The second one, it's going to be the little paint tubes. It's going to be what you find acrylic like watercolors, where it's just a paint tube that just has liquid paint inside of it that you're able to activate as well with water, or even use straight up like that. But if you're going for the watercolor look, you always want to add some water to it. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So of course the blues and greens in the paper already were done by the palette. I'm using the tubes now. As you can see, it's a different color but a very similar effect. Now the last one, it's going to be a liquid watercolor. There's some of these, there are not that many, they're a little bit newer. This one's I liked a lot, and it's just a drop of the very high pigmented liquid that you're able to dilute with the water. And again, overall you are going to have very similar looking results. The less water, the darker the color, The more water, the lighter it is. I just recommend sticking to one of them and getting more used to how the color blends on the paper, because you get a very similar result with all of them, but kind of have an idea of what they all are. Now the next tip is cheap can be good. It's very important to recognize that some art supplies are extremely expensive, and when it comes to watercolors, they are one of the priciest ones you can find out there, especially the tube ones. This palette I have right here is one of the cheapest ones you can find. I've actually found one for $5 at the store, and you have a lot of colors. Now they might not be very bright, they might not go on the paper very high density tone wise, but for a lot of colors they do work very well going on the paper, just as the most expensive paints do. So when you're starting out, don't feel like you need to spend a lot of money on there. Now tip number 6 is set with black. One thing that you will find that you're going to have a hard time getting with cheaper paint is going to be a nice dark black. I'm using not too much water on this black right here, and on the paper it looks pretty gray. Now this is my Dr. Martens black liquid watercolors, and you can also find them individually on the tube. So I always recommend, if you just get a tube of a little bit mid-grade watercolor of black, you do get a better black tone. So just using the same brush, you can get something very similar. I'm going to spill it in a minute because that's what I do, because I'm clumsy. I'm trying to get more, and guess what happens? I spilled it. But I'm going to show you, although it's a lot of paint, how much darker you're able to get with a more expensive black. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. If you want really black colors, the cheaper paints are just not going to deliver that. You can get away with using other colors from a cheaper palette, but just invest in just a right black. Tip number 7, get watercolor pencils. Now these are not with the other watercolor paint, because they're a little bit different. My set is Prismacolor watercolor pencils, but a lot of brands have them and they're cheaper and they work really well. They are basically a color pencil, and the lead inside of it can be watered down just like any other watercolor. This gives you a lot of different things you can do with them. You can have some very clean lines, you can do some shading like you would do with watercolor, you can go back and do different things. And just do something real quick, and just with some water you will see how it's able to reactivate it and just goes on the paper like watercolor. They usually do leave a little bit of a texture behind, so that's something to keep an eye on, but it could be something that what you actually end up wanting on there. Another thing that you can do is you can add smaller details on there. I'm going to move the paper around so it kind of looks. You can add some smaller details on there on top of it with the pencil, and it's still watercolor, so you can go back on top of it and add small details like freckles or eyelashes and stuff like that. Something else you can do, you can use it with different techniques. So that's something, maybe that will be a different video on what you can do with watercolor pencils, but I use them a lot and they're really good. Tip number 8, having a test paper. Now the reason for this is when you are painting a watercolor piece, you cannot look at your brush and really see the color that you are carrying in your brush. So I usually have a small piece of watercolor next to me, where after I load my brush I can quickly test it and see, do I have enough water? Is it too dark? Is it too light? Is the brush too dirty? Am I getting a contaminated color in there? So that way, before I apply it to the actual painting, I can see exactly what's going to be going on the painting. So for example, I have tested 3 different times the same color from the palette, just different water levels, just to see what type of color I will get. This will save you a lot of troubles. You never know what color you might have in your brush. You could pick up a different color and get it contaminated. You might want something lighter and you put down a lot of color, and then you have to figure out what you're going to do. So just a little dab on a piece of paper, it can even be a napkin, will let you know exactly what you have in your brush before you take that over to your painting, and you can keep yourself from ruining it. Next step, it is going to be tip number 9. Use 2 water cups. Very quick and simple. I use 2 water cups, once dirty water, once clean water. After I've used a color, I clean my brush in the dirty water, I dry it off, and then I use the clean water in order to get some more color for the next step. This keeps you from getting your colors dirty. The water gets dirtier, so will your colors. So have 2 of them. Tip number 10, don't be afraid to trace. Now this one's very specific to me. I have this sketch, I'm going through and I'm going to trace it with my watercolor pencils. I'm also after that going to trace it using a marker. This is going to give you a lot of different effects. So here's the one with the marker, and this one gives you a very nice clean cartoony outline, which could be what you're looking for. I use the watercolor ones. I'm going to talk about that one next. I use the watercolor ones because it allows me to paint on the paper without the pencil lines. So here I'm just giving myself about 2 minutes or so to color this in, so don't think too much about it. But all the pencil lines show through the watercolor, and most likely they will always will. If you're doing heavy sketching, if you have a little erase lines, they will show through your watercolor. So get yourself a small light table where you're able to trace your drawing. And here with the watercolor pencils, you would see, since I trace it, I don't have all this crazy pencil lines all over the place, and since it's watercolor pencils, the lines will end up dissolving into the watercolor paint. And this gives you a solid color area where you're able to get all the detail you need without having the pencil lines showing through. This can be very useful if you're doing something like flowers and you don't want a gray line outlining everything. For this case, I said I was just throwing some color under so you can see the difference roughly. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the one with the black outline. And you would see the same subject, similar colors. Of course, I didn't apply the same, I was rushing. You will see how different they all look just by having it traced on watercolor paper and getting rid of those pencil lines. So here we go, they all look very, very different, and it's just because I traced it into watercolor pencils, I can get a very cartoony look. I can have a very more muddy, realistic look without all the lines. You can have a very sketchy look with the original. So it's just going to give you very different looking parts throughout. Again, for this piece, you might like one more than the other, but it just gives you a little variation of what you're able to accomplish with watercolor pencils. Here's an example. I used watercolor pencils on this one, and I also did it for this one as well, and it allowed me to keep the colors aligned to the colors of it. So I used a brown for the skin, reds, purples, greens, according to what colors I wanted the paint to be like, without having an ugly gray line from pencils. So that's my tracing your piece after a sketch part. Tip 11, get masking fluid. Masking fluid, what is it? It is a little bottle of basically a type of liquid latex that shouldn't break the paper apart when it's removed unless you have low quality paper. I always suggest just doing a test run before you use it on the main piece. So what you want to do is, after you decide what you're going to paint, cover any areas you want to keep white, like or the color of the paper if you're using color paper, and paint over it. And then you're able to paint around it or paint over it with watercolors. Now make sure you paint the whole area down because I messed up and I didn't. So there's going to be some areas within my little cloud that have the color in it because I didn't cover it completely correctly. So you're able to do beautiful washes and gradients around certain areas, and after everything dries, you're able to go in and use your finger and rub the masking fluid away, which I forgot to say, let that dry first before you use any watercolor paint on it or around it, because it doesn't work if it gets wet. So let it dry first, then paint, then let the paint dry, and then you can go back with your finger and just lightly rub on it, and then it will start coming off just like eraser shaving. So there's a couple of spots I missed when I first painted it, but you get the picture. I got this beautiful colorful background and the white areas that I painted over. This is how I made all the white areas on this, the water, the highlights, the clouds, using masking fluid. Tip 12, allow the paper to dry. Something that happens a lot of times when I started doing watercolors is I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna paint this area, this color, I'm gonna go paint the color right next to it. Now here, the top part is going to be wet before I paint the color next to it. The bottom part, I'm gonna let it dry. This is what happens. It blends. If you want a sharp, crisp line, you need to let the paper dry before you do that. So for a lot of details, for a lot of overall shapes and forms, you do want to let the paper dry. So don't rush it. Get different colors down. Allow the paper to dry, especially when you're dealing with colors that do not blend well together, like contrasting colors. It gets ugly fast. So here, the top row is going to be painting one color after the other. The bottom one, I allow for the original color, in this case the yellow and the green, to dry, and then I painted the other color next to it. So here's a closer look. You can see how bad it bled on the top row versus how clean and sharp the lines are on the bottom row. Tip 13, use color for shading. So one of the things that a lot of people have a hard time going apart from is the whole add black to make a color darker, add white to make a color lighter. That is something that we get beat across the face in classes when we're little. Any art class is, you want a color darker, add black. But see what happens with this yellow once I add some black. You don't want to do this because you don't get a nice color. So you get nothing. You don't get any shading. All you get is just black and yellow, and not like the sun, doesn't work very well. It just doesn't blend very nicely. One thing you can do is to do some shading with different colors. Is if you're trying to stay away from the black, which I suggest unless you want something very dark, is look at the color you're using and look at the colors that are next to it in the color wheel. This will tell you what colors are able to blend with the original color nicely. So for the yellow, we got green, and we also got orange, are colors that use yellow in it as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some shading on these little spheres I did. Now might not always want to go so drastic. I just want to show you an example of how it can be done. You might always want to tone the colors down a little bit, but I'm going to do some shading with the orange, and you're going to see how much of a cleaner look you are able to get by doing shading, by using different colors instead of just going straight to the black. So I just added some orange, and I'm going to quickly blend it. If you notice, I'm using wet on dry, and both colors are pretty wet, so they're able to blend nicely. But see, I got a nice little gradient going from the yellow to the orange that I did not get when I just went straight to the black. And then you can go in and I'm adding a little bit of red just to get it a little bit darker. Now if I wanted to, I can go on the red and add some black. I didn't, because this is just little examples, but I'm able to get some shading done that looks a lot cleaner and crisper than what happened with the black. Now for the one on the right, I'm going to go to the other side of the color wheel, heading towards the blue. Between the yellow and the blue, we're going to have the green, so I'm going to do some shading on that side with the green. This can be done with a lot of colors. For example, if you want to you have some blues, you want to have some shading on it, using a dark purple works really nice. If you have a green and you want some shading on it, using some muted blue works very well. So it's all about keeping in mind what a color wheel contains next to the colors you're originally using, and that will allow you to really work on how to use color to do some shading, and it will really open up a lot of the tones you can use with lighting, a lot of the tones you can use with different subjects, and it allows you to pay a lot more. So you can have 3 different items being the same color, shaded differently, looking completely different, and looking like they're in a complete different environment. For example, let's say that's the inside of a sunflower. The orange shading could make it look like it's a sunset and we have a beautiful orange sky. The green shading could just be a very blue sunny day. So it's just about playing with the colors, but I do say that a lot of colors, especially yellow, the lighter the color, the least you want to use black to shade. So that's what I mean by using colors to do shading, is using the color wheel in this case. Tip 14, add white if you need to. So one of the things that's most difficult about watercolors, although the masking fluid can be very useful, is what if I just want to add some more highlights to my piece? What if it will just make it pop a little bit? You can use some white wash, you can use some white acrylic, which is what I'm using right now. You can even use a white gel pen and just going back, adding some highlights. Sometimes, you know, you could have missed that highlight on the eye. You could have missed that highlight to make something shine. You want to give something a little bit of sparkle. Don't be afraid to not use watercolor, use something else just to enhance your watercolor piece. So here I'm just adding a couple of highlights to this guy right here because I already did him before for this video. So I'm just adding a couple of highlights and just gives him more of a wet feeling, like he just got out of the water. So don't be afraid to add a little extra to your watercolors at the end to make them pop like that. And white is just one of the things you can't really get. Tip 15, clean your colors. So one of the biggest mistakes I made since the beginning after I started doing watercolors was getting really muddy colors. Now we always blend colors, you always go, you know, dirty water, colors bleed, you know, you get it too wet, you get little spots that splash here and there. Now I'm not making my palette pristine because I got all of the color mixtures on the palette that I like, that I can reactivate with water, but I'm going to all my lighter colors, so the yellows, oranges, light blues, and I just grab a piece of paper towel, dip into my clean water cup, and I just go back and just rub the top. And if you see my paper towel, it's a little dirty from all the different colors that got mixed into it. This is going to make sure that next time when you use your watercolors, when you go to use the yellow, it is yellow. I hope you enjoyed my video and you learned a couple of things. Let me know what you thought about it, what you found out that was new, what you already knew, and what videos you'd like to see me do next. Thank you so much for watching my video. Have a great day. Bye. Thanks for watching my video. Make sure to like it, leave a comment below, and for more art related videos, go to my channel and subscribe.